Hello everybody, thanks for joining me today, and if you are new, thank you for watching my video, and please subscribe to my channel for more guitar instruction and performance. Today's video will benefit not only guitar players, but composers, songwriters, music majors who are doing theory homework. This will help all of you. So the topic is secondary dominance. Don't be intimidated by that, okay? It's not rocket science. It's pretty easy, actually, to remember what a secondary dominant is. So when I have a student that comes in and they want to, let's say I'm helping them to compose a chord progression. This is the first thing I'm going to show them that they need to learn. Because when you're a composer / songwriter, you're going to have to choose what key your composition is in. That's like one of the very first decisions you have to make. And so here's the key of C. Then you must understand what chords belong to that family. And this is how it goes. You can see them labeled with names down below. So you have C major, D minor, E minor, F, G, A minor, and B diminished. And they're all labeled as well with Roman numerals. The lowercase Roman numerals tell you that it's a minor chord. So all of these are either major triads or minor triads. And we got one oddball over here, this diminished. That's the first thing you need to understand how to do. So whatever key you pick, you need to generate this in your mind. Now, that might seem easy, like, oh sure, I can count up the alphabet, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then you arrive back on your home bass note. If you change the key, let's say you want to write something in D major, you'd say, oh great, my 3 chord would be a D, an F chord, right? Wrong. You have to know about key signatures. It's a little tricky in that respect because if you pick the key of D, you have a couple of sharps to worry about and you have to apply those. So the 3 chord in the key of D is not an F something. It's F sharp minor because you have to apply the sharps from the key signature. So depending on what key you choose, you may have sharps or flats to deal with. So just be aware of that. And then there's kind of this hierarchy of chord functions. So getting back to my student. Hey, let's pick the key of C. Okay, here are the family of chords that belong in that key. And then the next thing I tell them is you can generally go anywhere you want in this family, choosing whatever chord you want at the time and stick them together to make a chord progression. And it'll sound good because they all belong to the same family. Let me just play these. As they're written in that chart, you have the following triads. C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, B diminished, and then you're back to your starting triad, which is C major. Now, as guitar players, do we use these shapes? If you play classical guitar, yes, you're using those shapes. But for most people who are doing strumming, those might look like this. C, D minor, E minor, F, G, A minor, B diminished, C. That's the family. And you basically can just dance around and pick whichever one of those chords you want to see what you get as a progression. And most of them will sound fine. Like I'll just randomly go and pick any of these from the family of C major. plan that out. I just randomly chose a chord from that family of C major, and it sounds great. So that's how you can come up with your own chord progressions. Now, after a while, that might seem a little bland, and you might want to add a little bit more spice. So that's where the secondary dominants come into play. Okay, we'll get back to chord progressions and strumming in just a minute. So for you theory students who are trying to label chord progressions, a lot of times it's in 4-part writing, but for instance, these Beethoven excerpts, you might be asked, hey, write a harmonic analysis of these chords. Again, if you know what key you're in, you can then generate that family of chords that you expect to come across in that key. So when might there be a chord that doesn't belong in that family? Well, a lot of times you get a tip-off because you'll see an accidental of some kind, like a sharp or a flat. And that's a little red flag to you to say, hey, maybe that chord is coming from a different key, or maybe it's a secondary chord. So in our hierarchy of chords from the family, we had the 1 chord. Now when we get to the 5 chord, those are like the pillars, strong pillars, structural points of most music. The 1 chord is your home base. The 5 chord has an unresolved feeling to it that wants to return. 1, 5, 1. Sometimes you can make that 5 chord a dominant 7th, like this. 5, 7, that has even more tension in it. That's a G7 chord. 1, 5, 7, 1. And that 5, 7 is called a dominant. A secondary dominant just simply means that you have a dominant 7th chord that's coming from another key. A dominant 7th that is not going to the 1. It's going to one of those other chords in the family, except the diminished. Okay, so you can have a 5 of 2, a 5 of 3, a 5 of 4, a 5 of 5, and a 5 of 6. And when you're composing, you'll see how that gives you a little bit more color and lift to your progressions. But getting back to the Beethoven examples, you can tell that there's a secondary dominant when you start seeing sharps or flats, because that means that chord doesn't belong to your normal key that you're in. So in this case, we are in the key of C, and this very first chord is a C, E, G, B flat. That's a C7 chord. Okay, it's not a 1 chord because you have a B flat in there. It's a C7. Now, look at the next chord that it's going to, an F. Well, what is the 5 chord of an F? F, G, A, B, C. It would be if you had a dominant 7th, be C7 going to F is a 5 to 1 in F. Well, we're not in F, so we're calling that F chord the 4. And so you just simply say, oh, well, you had a 5 of 4. And this C7 chord you would call a secondary dominant. Same thing with this one. You have a very prominent chord here that's going to 5, which is a G chord. But before it, you have this chord that has an accidental in there. So you're thinking, that might be a secondary dominant of where we're going, G. Well, what would the dominant chord of G be? G, A, B, C, D. And if you had a 7th chord, it would be a D7. And that's exactly what you have. You have D, F sharp, A, C, and that spells a D7 chord. How do you label it? Well, you don't label it like a capital 2, 7. the better label for that is just to say that it's a dominant chord of G. So it's a 5/7 of 5. Here's another example where there's some secondary dominants listed. This one is in the key of C as well. And this first circled chord has a C sharp in it. Whoa, well, there's no C sharp in the key of C major. So you know that must be coming from another key, and it's probably a secondary dominant. So where is it going to? If you look at the next chord, it's going to a regular D minor, that lowercase 2. So what's the 5 chord of a D? D, E, F, G, A. And so if you're going to D minor, you would have an A7, which would be the dominant of D minor. And so you just call that 5/7 of 2. It's that easy. So you're looking for chords that don't normally happen in that chart of the family of chords, and then you can usually label it as a secondary dominant. All right, so getting back to guitar and guitar progressions, let's just play some chord progressions and see if we can include some secondary dominants or hear some secondary dominants going on. So if we're in the key of C, 1, 4, 5, 1. Okay, I'll extend that a little bit. Okay, so we got C chord, G chord, A minor, F, G, C. Okay. All of those chords are in the family of triads of the key of C major. So there's nothing surprising going on there. However, maybe you hear a chord progression like this. So that second part of that chord progression, that E or E7 chord, that doesn't belong in the key of C major. You would normally have an E minor chord in the key of C major. We don't. We not only not have minor, but it's a dominant 7th chord, E7. So what's going on there? It's leading to the A minor. So you have like a little 5/1 in A minor. And so how would you label that? Okay, see that E7 going to A minor in the key of C? You would just say that E7 was the 5/7 of A minor, or the 5/7 of 6 in the key of C. And did you hear how that gave that progression a little surprising lift to it? I'll do it again. So here's chords from C major. Now here's the E7. Okay. The notes in that chord really give it a lift because we're borrowing that E7 and making it a secondary dominant of the A minor. Here's another one. Okay, here's just a typical 2/5/1. 2, 5, 1. But what if we put a secondary dominant before that 2 chord? In other words, put an A7 before D minor. Gives it a little lift. There's a secondary dominant. It's a 5/7 of D minor. Now, if I were to like linger on that for a while, would actually make you feel like you're in D minor for a little bit. So we use the words tonicize or modulate to indicate that we're temporarily feeling like we're in another key. And that's what secondary dominants can do if they're emphasized enough and for a long enough amount of time. Here's another one. So here's a 4, 5, 1 in the key of C. But what if you heard this? Okay, that second chord is a D7. Well, D7 doesn't naturally occur in the key of C major. If you look at that chart of triads, the D chord that we're supposed to have is D minor. Well, we have D7. Okay, so that's signaling to you that it's probably a secondary dominant going to whatever's coming next. Now, in this case, I didn't go to where you might expect it to go. I went directly to the 4 chord instead of a G. Then you get the G7 to C. So it just gives you a nice variety in your chord progressions to include some secondary dominants. Lastly, here's a kind of a fun little chord progression. You can see a series of dominant 7th chords before the final 5-1 in C. So what's happening here? Well, we're kind of backpedaling with a series of dominant 7th chords that are acting as secondary dominants. So a 5-1 in the key of C is G7 to C. Well, what if we backed up and had a dominant going to that G chord? G, A, B, C, D. You would have a D7, and that's exactly what we put before that G7. Well, what if we continue that? What's the 5 of D? D, E, F, G, A. We can put that behind it. And you can just keep successively, going backwards and having a 5 of 5 of 5 of 5. And you get a chord progression that sounds like this. Finally get where we're going. So if you want to have a chord progression that has that variety, whatever key you're in, that's the 1 chord, C. Go to the 5 chord, that's a G7. And then start thinking of the 5 of 5. So 5 above G, G, A, B, C, D, etc., etc. And you get E7, A7, D7, C. And you get this really cool, very colorful inner line there. Right? All right, everybody. That gets you a little bit familiar with what secondary dominant is, and now you can impress your friends by using that term secondary dominant, because now you know what it's used for and what it is and how to play some progressions with it as you're composing. So I hope that helps, everybody. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.